of Ukraine a short overview. In this presentation, I will focus on the major historical periods of the territory, what we call today as Ukraine. This is important to understand the very long and problematic history of this region because it helps us to understand also both the struggle of the contemporary Ukrainian people, their fight for the liberty, their fight for the independent country, their legitimization of their existence, basically. But we'll understand also why the aggressor, the Russian Federation, and especially its leader, Vladimir Putin, created its own meta history. So, to understand his imperial legitimization and its historical, so more like meta historical legitimization, we need to go back at least 1200 years in the past. And our story begins in the 9th century, where this large area, as you can see in the map, known today as the Kievian Rus, it's a large territory from the Baltic Sea to Central Europe today, the borders of today Romania, Ukraine, Poland. It's a very large area which represented one of the most important and largest East European political conglomerates and alliances in the early medieval ages. It is not really a state in the modern terms, so it's very important to know that it's not like a modern state or a well-organized state, but it is, of course, one of those early medieval kingdoms where there was an aristocratic group, the royal family, and their close group, which formed the elite of this hierarchical society, this horizontal society, organized by several tribes, especially Slavic tribes, the Eastern Slavic people who were part of this region. They were living in this region. The unification of these Slavic people, however, were made mostly by Vikings, the so-called Rurik dynasty, Rurik, the mythical figure of or the founder of this dynasty, and their descendants. So this is more like a Viking Slavic project, a common project which created this alliance of Slavic tribes, and it created this large medieval kingdom, or more like an alliance between these Slavic tribes and Vikings. Even this history and the role of the Vikings, the role of the northern people, the Norman people, if you want, was contested in the Soviet period, especially by Russian historiography, because of course it was derogating to acknowledge, to accept that the foundation of the first and most important medieval Slavic kingdom and power was founded actually by some Western European Vikings. Today, of course, the so-called Normanist and anti-Normanist discourse and historiography is finished. Most of the historians now unanimously accept that the Vikings had a very important part in the formation of the elite, but of course they were not alone. The local Slavic elites were also included, were also integrated very well in this organization of this kingdom. As you can see, the kingdom has a large area, and it was actually an alliance of larger cities: Novgorod, Polak, Smolensk, Murom, and of course Kiev. So these are the cities which today are partially in Russia, partially in Belarus, and also in Ukraine. So it's even more complicated that territorially this early Slavic state is now divided on many countries. Of course, in the beginning, in the 9th century, these people, the Slavic people and even the Vikings, were not Christianized and were not baptized. But in the 9th century, we will see a massive Christianization of these groups, especially from Byzantine influence. So it was part of the Byzantine Empire who was responsible for the Christianization of these groups in Eastern Europe. So we will see here an Eastern Christian group, an Orthodox Christian groups, especially with the beginning of Oleg the Great and later with Vladimir the Great. They represent the founders, the Christian founders of this alliance, of this political alliance in Eastern Europe. For a long time, it was considered that this so-called Kievian Rus was a separate and isolated entity in European history. However, we know today that actually these Slavic tribes and of course also the Normannic Viking groups had a very intense economic, cultural, familial relationship with Western Europe and also with Byzantine Empire, but even in Central Asian, the Khazar Empire and many other state formations or alliances. So it was well connected in many sense. It was somehow in between the West, the South, and the East. It was really on the edge of some major geopolitical areas, the steppe world and the continental Europe, the Mediterranean world, and also somehow the edge of the Silk Roads. So it was in a very important geopolitical position. What we're talking about is really the so-called intermarium between the seas, as you can see here also, between the Northern Sea, the Baltic Sea, and the Byzantine Empire, the Black Sea. So it was really a transitional area and united all these major geopolitical and cultural macro spaces. It has a very good relationship with all of these spaces. It gets its Christianity from Byzantine Empire, from the south, from the Eastern Christian tradition, but it had very intense familial diplomatic relationships with the West, with the Hungarian kingdom, with the Roman-German Empire, but also even with Western Europe, with France, for example, with familial bonds between different rulers. So it was well integrated both in the West and the Southeast of the continental European history in the medieval ages. In this time, obviously, we cannot speak about Russians or Ukrainians. None of these modern national entities, national notions exist in this time. So it's a non-existing notion. It's very uncommon, and it's not correct to use medieval Ukraine or medieval Russia. There's no such thing. These are modern inventions, modern identities, as we will see. This is why this part of their history, actually, of the history of the Slavonic people, are very problematic, as actually most of the medieval history in Europe, because both Russians and today Ukrainians can claim, and they are obviously claiming, that their birth, their origin are in this Kievian Rus kingdom or state formation, medieval alliance of Slavonic cities and tribes. So it is, of course, a problematic period of both modern identities, but certainly they have their roots in this medieval period. Already in this time, from medieval sources, especially from Western sources, we know about the Ruthenians as one of those numerous tribes living in this area. The Ruthenians often associated with today Ukrainians. However, as I mentioned, it's not necessarily the same group, but it's important to know that Ruthenians and Ruthenia is part of today eastern part of Romania, in this area um, of the Dnieper river. So somehow this is the heart. The Ruthenia is the heart of what we call today as Ukrainians. But these identities and these, of course, notions from the medieval period are not identical, are not the same with the modern ones today. This medieval kingdom and region was destroyed in 1237-1240 with the Great Mongolian invasion, which, as we know, also impacted and destroyed partially the medieval kingdom of Hungary and many other medieval state formations. It had a very strong impact generally in medieval Europe. It was a very short period, but reconfigured and reimagined, redraw the entire map of Central Eastern Europe after 1242. There are very few archaeological or monumental traces of this early period. One of them were in Kiev, the so-called Church of the Tithes, which already in the 16th, 17th century was ruined, but later was rebuilt, and unfortunately in the 20th century this rebuilt church was also exploded by the Soviet state. So today we have only its memory of one of the earliest churches founded by Vladimir the Great. There are many other monasteries, however, in these early cities, Novgorod, Kiev, and many Smolensk, and many others. We have a very large number of monasteries from this period of the Kievan Rus. After the Mongolian invasion from the 13th century onwards, this region, which we do know today Ukraine, a large part of Ukraine, and of course also today Latvia and Lithuania, part of Poland, Belarus, was part of another political entity. I would say this is more correct to this notion, political entity called the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Poland. This large area, of course, had a very problematic history, a very long history, founded by the Lithuanians, who had a slow but very powerful expansion in the 13th century, as you can see, from 1219 till 1236. Their king was Mindaugas, a pagan king, later Christianized. The Lithuanians were one of the last, if not the last, people of Europe who were Christianized. They had also a very intense political conflict with the Teutonic Order, which represented one of the strongest military orders in medieval Europe, and an expansion of the Germanic culture and political power. This war between the Teutonic Order and the Lithuanian kingdom ended in 1410 with the famous Battle of Grunwald, which basically stopped the Teutonic Order and their expansion, but it also was the official beginning, the golden age of this Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Poland. It was a large area with numerous people. It was a multicultural, multilinguistic, multi-ethnic area. It was really hard to unite this area. As you can see, there are many cities. There are numerous different periods when they were expanding. So it was a very problematic history. Already in 1490, so already in the 15th century, the Ruthenians, which you can see this central region today, mostly in Ukraine, they begin their rebellion. There were many rebellious movements. They tried to get out from this Grand Duchy of Lithuania. So it was already a kind of common identity of these groups. At least they as part of the European Renaissance movement, as one of the last Renaissance regions of Europe. Actually, it is Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Poland, the most eastern part of humanism and European Renaissance movements. As part of these movements or part of these European trends, the Ruthenians had also their own rebellion led by Petru Muka in 1490, and this represents actually one of the earliest signs or earliest traces where these Ruthenians might have some kind of collective identity. Of course, these rebellions are in the 15th century are still more like class rebellions. So the peasants and the marginals of the society fighting with the aristocratic part of the society. So it's really hard to imagine as some national movements. But of course, the Romantic historiography later presents the rebellion of Petru Muka as some kind of Ukrainian revival or the birth of the Ukrainian national identity. It's not really that. It's more like a social issue, very commonly in medieval Europe, of course. But indeed, their events are mostly centered in this area, which is today part of modern Ukraine. In the 16th century, there is also a linguistic revolution, and linguistic identities, local linguistic identities are born in this region. For example, the Ruthenian language produced its own Bibles, its own first text and literary opera, literary works, for example, Francis Karnia or Meleti Smotrichny, and the Ruthenian language was born as a separate language from this large area of Slavonic languages. In 1569, Lithuania is united with a part of Poland, and this region was even larger, even represents basically the medieval form of the Intermarium, the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, uniting these two areas. And of course, it's highly influenced by medieval Renaissance and humanism, Western art too. So it's really well connected with Western European cultural trends. However, in the east and in the south, there are two major changes. One is the so-called Crimean Kaganate, which was basically a Tatar kingdom or state formation, medieval state formation of the Tatar people. They were also later very much basically under the dominion of the Ottoman Empire. So the two great powers will slowly rise and will represent an external conflict, an external problem for this region. One is the Ottoman Empire, which is coming or growing from the south by the so-called Crimean Kaganate, and the other one is Moscow, the Grand Duchy of Moscow, where especially in the 15th century we will see numerous rulers, especially the famous Ivan the Terrible, who is responsible for the growth or expansion of Moscow. So Moscow before the 15th century, 14th, 15th century was not a significant city. Of course, it has its own history in early medieval times too, but in comparison with the other cities from Lithuania and Poland and this region, the central region of today Belarus and Ukraine, these cities has a much longer, much richer history. But Moscow in the 15th century is already a very important political power, and it will grow slowly but certainly, and will represent a problem for the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Poland. So again, basically the same situation. It's a kind of cyclicity of history, if you want. Again, there is two powers, one from the south, one from the east, which are somehow represents the problem of this region. In the same time, in the same period when the Duchy of Lithuania and Poland exist, appears some, let's say, a group of people, because it's really hard to name them as an ethnic group. It's more like a social status, the Cossacks. The Cossacks are the so-called free people. It's not an ethnic group, because there were many types of Cossacks, depends on their regionality, depends on their language, dialects. So it's not really one type of, it's not really an ethnic identity, it's more like a social status. It's one of the marginals, the free marginals of the medieval society. There were many similar groups in Central Eastern Europe, but even in the Western Europe we can find some similar groups, of course, in less significant and less powerful formations. So the Cossacks are the free people of the marginal part of the society, most of them obviously from Slavic identities and languages. They speak Slavonic languages. In the 15th, 16th century, they already have their own colonies or cities, or not really cities, but like settlements separated from the duchy, or it was, of course, an anti-system movement. They had their own administration, they had their own rulers, their own social organization, which was, of course, a very loose, a very almost semi-nomadic type of group. They were responsible for attacking the Ottoman ports and cities in the south, and they had intense conflicts with the Tatar Kaganate and later with the Ottoman Empire, of course. Their movement was actually represented a problem not only for the Ottoman Empire but also for the Duchy, the Great Duchy of Lithuania and Poland. So it was this rebellious group, this hardly definable group of Cossacks with different regions, most powerfully in the Crimea and today southeast Ukraine. They are the most powerful group of Cossacks who will later form their own kingdom, if you want, so-called Hetmanate. So due to these movements, mostly by the Cossacks, and their conflict with the Ottoman Empire, the Slavonic people and for people from the Lithuanian and Polish Duchy will have a council, the so-called Pereyaslav Council, in 1654, and later the treaty or the Truce of Andrusovo in 1667. Both events represent, unfortunately for today, from contemporary historical reasons, basically the first steps for uniting with the Duchy of Moscow. So the emerging state, the Great Duchy of Moscow, which will transform in the 17th century into one of the most powerful political entities, states in Europe. This area, which was a very unstable area already in the 17th century, trying to find their own protection because of the Ottomans, because of other emerging powers in the West. So they decided that the best way is to get protection or to find a treaty with the Russians, with Moscow. So this is the reason why we have these two important steps in 1654 and in 1667. These treaties or councils where the Cossacks and many other groups, the Slavonic groups in the Duchy of Lithuania, the former Duchy of Lithuania, are actually slowly englobed by the Duchy of Moscow. The Cossacks, however, will form their own hetmanate, which existed till the 18th century, the so-called Kamenicky Uprising, which was the formation or the birth of this Hetmanate, this local kingdom of the Cossacks, which existed less than 120 years, with very short-lived existence of this Cossack independent state. Of course, later, especially 19th, 20th century Ukrainian history, again romanticized and claims that these early Cossack states are also somehow the part of the independent Ukraine's idea. But again, similarly to the Ruthenians and similarly to the Kievan Rus, the Cossack states are also very mixed, ethnically very mixed regions, and it's hardly to say that they were Ukrainians. They didn't have this self-identity, but indeed it represents an important feeling of independence and freedom, both from the Ottoman Empire and both from the Duchy of Moscow, and of course the Lithuanian Polish history. So they try to find their self, they try to find their own history in that region. This is the region what we're talking about. This Cossack Hetmanate today, they are famous. They had some anecdotes related to their history, like the so-called reply of the Cossacks for the Sultan, eternalized by this famous painting of Repin in the 19th century. But of course, it might be just a legend. And finally, after the Cossacks and basically all the Ruthenians and these Slavonic people in this region united with the Duchy of Moscow, or they had these treaties from the 17th century, they realized very early, especially after the expansion of Moscow during the age of Peter the Great, the formation of the Russian Tsar, the Russian Empire, that their position is actually worse than was in the Lithuanian and Polish commonwealths, as they said, of course, as a modern notion. So they decided, less than 40 years after the Treaty of Andrusovo, that they want to separate from Moscow. And this conflict with the new Russian Empire is represented or symbolized by Ivan Mazepa and his movement, his revolution, as many says. Ivan Mazepa was again a Cossack, and his most famous battle with the Russians was with the Swedish people together. It was in an alliance between the Cossacks and the Swedish kingdom. Fortunately, ended in Poltava in 1709 in the victory of the Russian Empire. So their history, the history of this region from Poltava till even now, is actually defined and marked by the dominant power of Moscow, of the Russian Empire. So this was one of the last chances of the Cossacks to get rid of the Russian Empire, which, as I mentioned, their friendship or their alliance existed only like 40 years. This was the great duchy of Lithuania and Poland, which was in the 18th century divided and destroyed by the newly emerging power of the Russian Empire and the newly emerging kingdom of Prussia from the west and the Habsburg Empire from Central East Europe. So three big empires will reshape this map in the 18th century, which will mark also the history of the Polish people. Poland as a state, as a medieval kingdom, will disappear in the map of Europe, but also Lithuania and the Cossacks and also all region we can see here, Belarus and today Ukraine, will be fully integrated in the emerging Russian Empire in the early 18th century. So the map of Europe is radically reshaped in the 18th century. Larger states will be formed. The British Empire will be born. The Prussian kingdom are emerging. The Habsburgic Empire and as I mentioned, the Russian Empire, and the old one is the Ottoman Empire, which is in the 18th century shows very clearly that it's losing its power. And we have also the French Empire, French Kingdom, but with less implication in this part of Europe. So this area, which we call as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, will be destroyed in three major steps between 1772 and 1795, between these three emerging empires, the Russian, the Prussian, and the Habsburgic. In the 19th century, after this radical reshaping of the European map and the merging of these new empires, a very interesting thing happens in Europe as basically as a consequence of the not totalitarian, but the absolute kingdoms and the consequence of the newly emerging empires in the end of the 18th century as a consequence of the French Revolution also, and the emerging new class of citizens, especially in urban environment. Europe will face the history of nationalisms, the arrival and the revival of national identities. This happens everywhere in Europe, but especially in Central Eastern Europe is very powerful. This is the period actually from the end of the 18th century where we can really talk about now about Ukrainians. Ivan Kotlyarevsky was one of the earliest Illuminist poets and one of the earliest writers who claimed himself that he's writing in Ukrainian. Taras Shevchenko, as you can see in this photo, is one of the national poets of Ukraine today, but also Ivan Franko had a very important impact in what we call today as Ukrainian identity. So these identities, these local identities, were born in especially in the 19th century, as a resistance towards Moscow and the Russian Empire. So within the Russian Empire, the Ukrainian national movement is one of the strongest ones. Not the only one, of course. We have the Finnish Movement, again, is one very, very famous, the Finnish national movements against the Russian Empire. But we have also other Baltic states who have their own national revivals in the 19th century. The Ukrainian national revival also produced numerous literary works, poems, and many other works. There was even a female poet, Leisa Okranka, and a famous historian, Rushevsky, who was the national historian, the romantic positivist historian of Ukraine in this period, and even he played a very important role in the early 20th century history of this region. So, in the end of the 19th century, although there is no such thing as Ukraine in this region, as you can see, the reshaped map of Europe in the 19th century looks totally different, and is, especially in this area, Central Eastern Europe, is the history of the big empires, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the German Empire. So these are the three powers in Central East Europe, which represent also an alliance. They represent a very strong alliance. Personal and familial bonds between the monarchs and between the royal families, and also, as you can see, geographic and historical memories and meta-histories from the medieval times. So this region was highly connected between each other, not only by its geography, but also by their medieval history, Renaissance history, but also by geopolitical reasons. And of course, this is one of the main problems, main issues, which caused also the First World War, the alliance between the German Empire and Russia. Was one of the biggest problems for Western alliances, the Entente. It was one of the biggest conflict, this alliance, but also the existence of these Central East European empires and their national movements, their national ethnic composition was, of course, on long term unbearable and very problematic. So the Ukrainian national movement, which, as you can see here, had its own echo in the Western literature in France too, of course, doesn't exist. There is no Ukraine on this map, as you can see, but of course, exist in literature, exist in the mentality already of the elite. Of course, it's hard to estimate the real impact of this identity. How many people believed on, or how many people self-identify themselves as Ukrainian in the 19th century? It's really hard to estimate that, but at least we know that it exists. The movement as a national movement exists, even if maybe not comparable to Central Eastern Europe, other Central Eastern European national movements or Western nationalisms. The 20th century history of Ukraine is even more problematic. What was an utopia only and a dream of these poets in the 19th century, it became a short and painful reality in the early 20th century. After 1917 November, where there was a Bolshevik revolution in Kiev, following, of course, the major events in St. Petersburg and Moscow, they also have their own Bolshevik revolution, and just 1 year after, so there was a very dynamic and bloody year from 1917 to 1918, a very short-lived Hetmanate of Ukraine was formed. It was a conservative state with somehow evoking the memory of this Cossack Hetmanate from the 17th century, but it was not really working. It was an unfunctional, problematic, politically very problematic state. And after this, the independent Ukraine, the Ukrainian People's Republic, was formed in the end of 1918, and it existed only 3 years, or less than 3 years, till 1921. So for 3 years, we can talk about an independent Ukraine in this period, but it was a very chaotic, it was a very anarchic period, not only in this area, but also in whole Europe. It was the changes of states, the borders, the Treaty of Versailles, which reshaped radically the history of Europe, and not only. This newly formed Ukrainian People's Republic was led by mostly military people. For example, Volodymyr Vinchenko, who was the prime minister, and this Simon Petliura, as you can see in this photo, he was the supreme commander of the Ukrainian army, and later the president of this new state. Unfortunately, this state had their own atrocities already. In less than 3 years, they killed almost 50,000 Jews. It was the earliest pogroms, it was the earliest anti-Semitic pogroms in the history of Central Eastern Europe, unfortunately, organized by Petliura and his staff. This was a very shortly existed state. You can see here the first prime minister of Ukraine, some pictures from the revolution of Kiev in 1917, and a very interesting poster, commemorative poster of the Ukrainian Revolution, which represents actually the quintessence of Ukrainian nationalism from the 19th century, their dream for a free country, independent from the Russian Tsar, the Russian Empire. You can see here these two-headed animal, which represents the Russian Empire, with a knife in his hand, obviously representing some very bad and negative power. Even on the edges of this poster, you can see a lion fighting with a dragon. So there is almost a mythical fight between the Russian Tsar, the Russian Empire, and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian national movement is represented by Kiev, its medieval history, the statue of Vladimir the Great, the tomb of the national poet of Ukraine, and a mother with the Ukrainian flag. So we have the full symbolism already, which we know today in Ukrainian coat of arms, in Ukrainian flag, and so on. So this was formed already just right after the First World War. Unfortunately, this state, which was, as I mentioned, not really unproblematic, was englobed and transformed into a Soviet republic in 1922. It was a short period of transition, again, with very strange and bloody revolutions and local conflicts, but in 1922 it was already transformed into a Soviet republic. Grigory Petrovsky, as you can see here, is one of the infamous persons who is responsible for the transformation of this state into a Soviet republic, and later, unfortunately, in 1932, Ukraine will suffer one of the largest famines in the history of Europe, the so-called Holodomor, which is a consequence of Stalin's collectivization and the radical transformation of the Ukrainian agrarian society, peasant society, rural environment. It had millions of victims. Ukrainian historiography argues that it is genocide. Western and others are using as a great tragedy of humanity. So there's still a debate with the notion itself, but in any case, the Holodomor was 1932-33 was one of the great tragedies of humanity in that period, just right before the Second World War. In the Second World War, Ukraine will be divided again, partially by the German Nazi Empire, the Third Reich, and the Soviet Union. There are many Nazi collaborators in Ukraine in this period, mostly young people who are going even voluntary to the concentration camps. We have a famous case rediscovered in 1986 in the United States, for example. But this was a short period during the Second World War, when after the Second World War, actually Ukraine will gain some new territories. So the new Ukraine after 1947 will gain some new regions. In 1947, in the Paris Treaty, which officially ends the Second World War, there will be some territories regained by the Soviet Union or even reconquered by the Soviet Union. For example, Transcarpathia, Bukovina, and many other regions from Romania, from the Crimea, for example, was englobed in 1954, which was till then part of the Russian Soviet Republic of Russia, and now in 1954 it is given to the Ukrainian Soviet state. Of course, all of these changes are basically symbolical because all of them part of the Soviet Union, so it's just symbolic modifications of borders, but and it's all part of the Soviet Union. The independent history of Ukraine, which begins in 1991, is also extremely problematic and very long. Even if we are talking about 30 years of history, it's really a problematic history. I forget to mention that already in the 1960s, large diaspora of Ukrainians exists around the world, mostly in the United States, where they form in 1967 the Alliance of Ukrainian Congress, the World Congress of Ukrainians, of Free Ukrainians, and they will have an important role in the reformation, the reconfiguration of this new independent state. It begins with a massive protest in 1990, 1.5 years later, there is the official declaration of independence of Ukraine on the 24th of August, which is the official national holiday of Ukraine, Day of Independence. On the 1st of December 1991, they organized a referendum, and 90% of the population then claimed and voted for independence from Russia. Even in Crimea, which was mostly populated by Russians, 56% voted for the independence in 1991. The next 4 years are dominated by the so-called Kravchuk era. Leonid Kravchuk was the first president of Ukraine. As in everywhere in Central Eastern Europe, unfortunately, this period is extremely hard. It begins the privatizations, the total collapse of state economy, the large industrial centers are left and collapsed, so it's really a very, very hard period for Ukraine too. But it was very hard also for Romania and most of the post-communist or the former Soviet bloc. After 1994 comes almost 10, 11 years, the so-called Kuchma, the Leonid Kuchma period. Another president for 11 years, famous for corruption, the formation of local oligarchies, economic boom. There is somehow after 2000 an economic growth in Ukraine, but full with oligarchic and problematic networks forming and monopolizing some fields of the economic life in Ukraine. It's somehow for Romanians well known. Prime Minister Adrian Năstase might be a similar person in this story. What is important, however, in this period is the Budapest Memorandum. The Budapest Memorandum was an agreement between Ukraine and Russia, sanctified by the Western powers, that the Ukraine will destroy or will eliminate the atomic and nuclear arms and arsenal, and for a guarantee, Russia will guarantee the territorial independence and sovereignty of the country. So the Budapest Memorandum, as it says, is a memorandum. It's not really a treaty, but it was an official meeting, and it was now today, of course, has a very important moment. It a very important role in contemporary crisis. It happened in 1994. The president of Russia was still Yeltsin, so it was another period. After 2000, we know that Russia will face a new age, the age of Putin, Vladimir Ilyich Putin. Of course, in the first years, in the first 7, 8 years, Putin is radically different than today's Putin. Russia will have a radical restructuration of its economy, a radical political and economic growth. So it was unpredictable how Putin will act in this period. We know that the relationship between Putin and Bush in the early 2001-2 period was relatively good. However, then the United States will leave the atomic agreement and the nuclear agreement between Russia. So the United States is the first who left this agreement. And later, Russia, of course, will slowly isolate itself from the West. After 2003 especially, we will have more and more signs that this illusion, which was visible between Yeltsin and Bill Clinton, for example, is unfortunately not really working. So the signs were there already in the 2000s when Kuchma was the president of Ukraine, and the larger powers, the United States and Russia, were having more and more political and ideological differences. In 2004, is a very important culminating moment when Viktor Yanukovych and Viktor Yushchenko are fighting with each other. Many historians argues that this was already the so-called Orange Revolution was a fight between the East and West. Of course, it's not that simple, but definitely these two personalities, which both are coming from the Ukrainian oligarchic system, however, with different political identities and networks. Viktor Yanukovych was obviously a pro-Russian, a pro-Moscovite politician. Yushchenko was even poisoned in 2004, was somehow between the West and a very local national Ukrainian identity. So it's still hard to define his political identity, but definitely was more closer to the West. The Orange Revolution was also an extremely hard period for Putin himself, because it was clear that Ukraine want to separate not only politically, ideologically, but also militarily, in every sense, from Russia. Viktor Yushchenko was the president from 2004 till 2010. He, in this period, was full with political crisis, famous Yushchenko-Timoshenko fights, and internal political crisis, which influenced, unfortunately, stagnated Ukraine in one position. In this period, is important that as a consequence of the Orange Revolution, Putin changed radically its policy in Ukraine. He argued, he saw in this revolution as a threat for his own power. He saw that if the West was able to support the revolution, the Orange Revolution of Yushchenko, then might be even a Moscow revolution soon. So he somehow felt that the Soviet system, the Soviet Empire is collapsing. Its own states are transforming slowly into something else. They became NATO members, they became EU members. Now even Ukraine is slowly is transforming. So after 2004, Putin felt a threat, a political threat, a diplomatic or somehow an ideological threat, an expansion of the spheres of influence, as they says, of the West. This was extremely clearly stated and explained by Putin himself in 2007 in München and 2008 in Bucharest. Both speeches actually are clearly reflecting the radical change of Putin's ideological evolution. So, as an argument for those who are shocked by this war, unfortunately, historians knew very well that this was almost inevitable already in 2008 as a consequence of the Orange Revolution. But, well, many things happened since then. A new president came in the United States, a person of Obama. Of course, a new president in Ukraine in 2010. Viktor Yanukovych came in Ukraine, who was, as I mentioned before, Yanukovych was pro-Russia and pro-Moscow, friend of Putin. So somehow this conflict was eased, or at least transformed into a local Cold War. But this lasted only 3 years, because in 2013, November, Ukraine, some parties of Ukraine tried to sign a treaty, an agreement with the European Union. It was an association agreement, more like a commercial economic agreement. But Yanukovych, probably on the pressure of Putin, didn't sign this agreement, but instead he signed another one, which made even closer relationships with Russia. So this shift, and which is obviously a again an ideological shift from the west to the east, was the reason why in November 2013 the so-called Euromaidan protest begins on the large Maidan square of Kiev. You can see the lower picture, this large protest which lasted many months till 2014 February, when finally Yanukovych left the country. So there was even a political change on the presidential level. Unfortunately, however, Putin, as somehow a response to this radical shift, annexed Crimea. So the annexation of Crimea, which was the first step in going inside an independent sovereign state of Ukraine by Putin, was the annexation of Crimea. Very interestingly, this moment happened extremely fast because Crimea was part of Ukraine only for 60 years, since 1954, and also because most of the population were Russian. So it was much easier. And of course, it was a highly tensioned period in Ukraine. Not everybody was against Yanukovych. So it was also an internal political division within Ukraine. In April 2014, the Donbass War begins, so 8 years ago, and actually many historians still using this 2022 invasion as part of this Donbass War. Because Putin in 2014, in the spring of 2014, obviously decided that these internal conflicts, these so-called colorful revolutions, the Orange Revolution, the Euromaidan Revolution, these are all threats for his own power. These are threats for its own imperial vision, which is somehow the re-establishing the former Soviet states. It's the new Russia, the idea of Dugin and many other philosophers who might influence the ideology of Putin, or it fueling the ideology of Putin on a new, strong Eastern Steppe Empire, the Eurasian Empire of Russia, in close connection with Germany and Europe. So this Eurasian Empire, which is not a sea-dominated empire like the US or the former British Empire, this is a land empire which goes from the Atlantic till the Pacific, without important sea power, but with strong earthly connections. So this Eurasian Empire and this idea of Putin to re-establish somehow the Soviet sphere of influence as a contra power of the Western sphere of influence and hegemony of the United States was obviously stopped by these independent movements and Western movements in Ukraine. The age of Poroshenko, Petro Poroshenko, in from 2014 and 19, somehow was again, even if he was maybe a bit closer to Moscow than to the West, but he had a very local national identity. He also signed the Minsk agreements, which was somehow a ceasefire agreement between Russia and Ukraine, or somehow to re-establish the safety of the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine. So Russia signed these Minsk agreements. There are two different agreements. But Poroshenko began this very strong local national identity of the Ukrainian state. It was also part when the local minorities were extremely hardly hit by discriminating laws and very bad treatment, both the Russians, of course, mostly the Russian minorities, but even the smaller minorities in Transcarpathia and Bukovina too, Romanians and Hungarians as well. So this very strong local national identity of Poroshenko was actually continued by the new president from 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky, who is now a world hero and the famous, probably the most famous person on Facebook. So this conflict, which we face today, it begins at least in 2004 with the Orange Revolution. But it might have, of course, much longer frustrations, much longer conflicts, and especially in the mind of Putin itself, his own personality, of course, which is well known today by numerous books. He is somehow similarly to Hitler, who was disappointed after the First World War. It has its own personal disappointment and its own personal frustration that the German Empire was collapsed after the First World War. The same personal frustration we see in the interviews of Putin, for example, the Oliver Stone film. We see obviously that he is personally having a messianistic frustration and a messianistic role that to re-establish what was destroyed by the West in 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So we have here this vision of Putin, which obviously has its own realities, that it was a huge naivety to believe in 1990, as Fukuyama said, that the history ended. And the dominance and the hegemony of the liberal democracies will have now an eternal phase of a world global dominance. It was a naivety, and it probably we can argue what was not made, what should be made and done for avoiding this conflict, which is, as Anne Applebaum argued, it's a clash of civilizations. And it is indeed, if you see this history of the last 30 years, it's pretty clear, and even the mind of Putin reflects this, that this is a clash of civilizations, a mistake which was perhaps naively undone and ignored after 1990 in the euphoria of 1990 and 1989 revolutions. But unfortunately, it seems that it's erupted now, and of course, Ukraine and the Ukrainian people are suffering this undone history and process between the West and the former Soviet Union, Putin as representing the memory, the meta history of the Soviet Union.